In 1977, 35 years after beginning his professional career as a concert pianist, the renowned pianist Seymour Bernstein, without warning, entirely left the public eye as a performer due to crippling stage fright. He had tried everything that he had seen some others use, including eating chocolate, but that gave him a sugar shock, and even putting egg whites on his hands, but that left an omelet on the keyboard. Bernstein is just one of the many pianists who have had to leave the stage for mental health and mental performance challenges. And it's no wonder because starting among university students, arts and humanities students reported the most stress, anxiety, and depression among all students. Further, across quality of life variables, both college and professional musicians scored the lowest on psychological health. In particular, pianists have reported the most acute symptoms of stress, but the fewest amount of coping strategies among other instrumentalists. One explanation of these results is that pianists practice numerous hours a day, and the more hours of practice has been suggested to lead to higher levels of performance anxiety. Unfortunately, in general, the field promotes a norm quantity rather than quality of practice. For example, one concert pianist said in an interview, "I practice a lot, you have no idea. I only stop practicing when I'm on an airplane, and even then there are times when I do it mentally. I never stop, I never take holidays." Unfortunately, many musicians struggle to find coping strategies for their mental performance, often concluding that the only way to cure stage fright is preparation and performance experience. Even still, somehow these pianists have achieved professional success despite the high pressures of the field. Therefore, this study aimed to examine the strategies professional pianists are using to cope with the stress and stress responses of their daily lives in relation to the mental skills we already are using in sports psychology. To examine this population, we collected a corpus of 305 interviews found on YouTube and blogs anytime before 2024 with elite professional pianists. Pianists were included as long as they had a complete knowledge panel in a Google search. In total, we extracted 1,077 quotes from the interviews describing any stressor, stress response, and/or coping strategy that they discussed. Just briefly to give you an idea of the demographics of the pianists we studied, over 70% were men, and the age range was 17 to 107, with most coming from their 30s and 40s. Most of the interviews were taken from the past 10 years, and on the left you can see the various places they come from. Certain places like Russia, North America, France, and Germany were individually categorized to capture the different piano schools of pedagogy, but overall 52 countries were represented in the corpus. To code the quotes, we used a thematic analysis with inter-rater coding based on Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping. This framework has been used previously in qualitative studies among both athletes and musicians. For example, one study found that most common appraisal response among musicians is overwhelmingly threat. In this study, we focused on examining the stressors, stress response, and appraisals as a whole, and the coping strategies. These three components were then broken down into main and subcategories. When coding the stressors, we originally wanted to put them in the traditional organizational, performance, and personal stressors, but it ended up working best to categorize the stressors based on 7 settings. Here you can see that the most commonly discussed settings for stressors included general stressors when building a career, stressors when on stage, and stressors when practicing. Other settings less discussed were extra-musical, competition, post-performance, pre-performance, and the recording stressors. From these main stressor settings, numerous subcategories emerged, with the most commonly discussed stressors being achieving success in their career. For example, one pianist said, "We have a very narrow-minded tunnel vision of what it means to be a successful musician. This definition of success is hammered into us from a young age, that true success is the pianist that performs this repertoire or performs with these groups or performs in these halls. This is success, and this is the only way to success. And the way to getting there is practice forever and ever, have no life, enter every competition ever, and try to win them." Performing well on stage was another common stressor. For example, there are times when you see the piano on stage and you just can't walk out. It is a time when you think any other job would have been better than this one. Other common stressors were overcoming the norm of practicing for quantity rather than quality and maintaining physical health. When examining the stress responses, 5 main categories emerged as somatic or cognitive stress response, overcompensation, negative affect, diminished self-concept, and anhedonia. We also created a 5th category to capture explicitly positive appraisals to indicated stressors. Evidently, the most common subcategory of stress response discussed was anxiety. Often, the anxiety was reported to be induced by the fear of a memory slip, as with this quote. Some other more prevalent categories also included experiencing self-doubt, frustration, and an overloaded schedule. For example, one pianist wrote, "It is very hard to juggle all the projects from solo, concerto, chamber music, commissioning works, sitting on juries. I joke that even on my deathbed, I'll still have a whole list of repertoire I want to learn." When examining the coping strategies of these elite pianists, 8 main categories emerged, the most frequent clearly coming from reframe or change in mindset, and the lowest coming from other common sports psychology strategies such as imagery and goal setting. Other strategies included identity development, self-efficacy for completing the work, various focuses of attention, prioritizing mental and physical well-being, and finding sources of inspiration. Some of the most prevalent subcategories including having a growth mindset. For example, having a growth mindset that there is always something more to learn about a piece you've been playing for years and years and years. Another strategy was having a stronger self-trust in their abilities and ideas, as this quote demonstrates. Other strategies were being creative in building a career, changing their focus of attention to musical expression instead of just playing the right notes, finding the courage to say no and be assertive, and prioritizing quality over quantity of practice. Now I will walk through a transactional model of just a couple of examples of particularly prevalent stressors, stress responses, and strategies that these pianists used. So for example, when career was the main stressor and success was the sub-stressor of that main category, we found that 29.5% of the time the pianist would use a self-concept kind of orientation of stress response, and that would often be shown through self-doubt. And then a strategy that they would use to try to cope with this would 39.2% of the time would be to have a switch in their mindset, and oftentimes this would be a mindset of growth and hope that things could change. When the main stressor was in the performance setting and the sub-stressor was to perform well, we often saw a stress response 79.8% of the time, and 75.2% of the time it was a sub-stressor response of anxiety. And then to cope with this, the pianist 40% of the time would again use this mindset reframe. However, the most common coping strategy was exposure, meaning that they would try to play more concerts and just gain experience. Whenever the main stressor was in the practice setting, so that was the third most prevalent main stressor, and particularly when they would feel the stress of needing to practice for quantity rather than quality, the stress response would be this overcompensation 76.1% of the time, in which they felt like they needed to overtrain. And then a coping mechanism for this would be to set goals and focus more on the quality of their practice instead of the quantity. So just to summarize what we discussed throughout this study, we had the main stressors, stress responses, and coping strategies, and we found that the main stressors were from the career setting, the performance on stage setting, and the practice room setting. And then we found that some of the main stress responses were particularly those of cognitive or somatic anxiety. And then oftentimes the most prevalent strategies that were being used were a switch or reframe in mindset, and not very much the other sports psychology techniques that we discuss to be really helpful for athletes, including things like imagery and goal setting. We can also draw insight from previous studies with musicians in general. For example, Byrne and colleagues found that the most prevalent perceived stressors evoking performance anxiety were pressure from self, evaluation from the audience, and trait anxiety. The same study found that the most commonly used coping mechanisms for performance anxiety included deep breathing, just practicing more, and familiarization with the venue. Unfortunately, even though, according to Kegliers et al., found that mental preparation was the third highest predictor of audition outcome, performers were only reporting mentally preparing for less than 2% of their total weekly musical activities. Additionally, only 7.9% of musicians sought a psychologist to help cope with their music performance anxiety. Even though my purpose was to see what elite pianists are already doing in their mental performance that may have influenced their success, the reaction I was left with was primarily a call to address this gap, because not only are these professionals using an overwhelming amount of CBT reframes, they are probably passing these messages on to their students. For example, just trust yourself or just be confident can actually reinforce that there are two things wrong with the performer. For example, they might first already be experiencing the sense of shame that they're not good enough, but now if they can't be confident, they don't know how to trust themselves, now they have two problems that just reinforce this I am not good enough as a performer. So I encourage you all to consider reaching out to music programs to introduce this work that we do that is incredibly important and can really revolutionize some of the norms in the field. And this database can still also inform our applied work with musicians and just understanding the things that they are used to hearing. I am especially thanking my Interator coders who helped code my data, as well as my professors for supporting me in this work, to ASP 2024 for having me present and welcoming me, and to the Aspire grant that Ball State University gave me to travel to this conference. Here are my references. And thank you so much for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I would be absolutely happy to dialogue more about this topic.